Good afternoon, everyone. We're at 2 o'clock, so we can resume the hearings. This afternoon, we're dealing with matter 13, which is climate change, and then moving on to matter 14, which is health and well-being. There's a couple of things we need to do before we get on with the discussion. I think properly, given that there's some new faces here, we should do some housekeeping announcements first, if that's okay. Over to you then.
Right, just a couple of minor points to highlight. First of all, hopefully you've all signed in at the desk at the front. If not, can you go and sign in a break, just so we're aware of who's with us. In terms of door security, just use the main door for access in and out of the building. Don't use the side doors, please. We aren't expecting any fire alarms to go off this afternoon, so if they do go off, there will be a genuine emergency. If that does occur, please exit the building through the front doors and congregate by the traffic lights on the corner of Gillygate and Claremont Terrace. There are a few other users in the building today, so just be aware that people will be milling around. In terms of Wi-Fi, the code, if you sign a Citadel guest, and the password is General Booth 1883 with a capital G and capital B. We are recording sessions today, so if you do have an issue with that, please see a member of the team and we'll sort out locating you away from the camera. Please keep your mobile phones on silent, and if you wish to speak, please raise your name card on the end, get the intention inspectors, and when you want to speak, press the red button on your microphone. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. What may assist also is if we go around the room and introduce ourselves briefly. Mr. Henderson, I'll start with you.
Thank you, sir. Matthew Henderson on behalf of the City of York Council.
Good afternoon, Laura Bartle, City Council.
Sean Gibbons, City of York Council.
Mark Waters, Osborne Wick and Derwent Ward.
I'm Paul Ainsworth from the Campaign for Real Ale.
I'm Councillor Pete Kilbane for York Labour Party.
Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation.
Catherine Dukes, Directions Planning.
Tony May, York Civic Trust.
Dave Merritt, York and District Trades Union Council and York Environment Forum.
Thanks, everyone. That's helpful. I want to deal with matter 13 on climate change first, and then we'll come on to health afterwards. And I think properly, given that there's some quite extensive modifications proposed to the relevant policies, I'm going to come to you, Mr. Henderson, first to take us through that.
Sir, thank you very much.
And give us a background. So
yes, I will. Yeah, you have, hopefully we've distributed copies around the room. That document is what was included as the appendix to the Council's matter statement for this matter, and we've printed it out so that everybody has a copy this afternoon, given, as you say, there have been a number of changes to the policies that we're here to discuss. Ms Bartle and Mr Gibbons will talk through those in just a moment, but I want to address three sort of overarching issues that have come up in a number of representations, and I do so at the outset with the hope that this will speed matters up. The first is the context for the assessment of soundness. You will recall back in phase 2, matter 8, we dealt with a number of the overarching strategic issues about climate change. And we say that is the important context for which we consider the soundness of these policies today, specifically looking at section 19 of the 2004 Act, the requirement for the development plan documents taken as a whole to contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. That is the legal starting point, and the NPPF is the framework through which we approach that. The obligation is on the development plan documents as a whole, firstly. So that means we're not, in considering climate change, it is of course those policies that we have before us today, but it is all the policies, and we've already touched on in other sessions how climate change runs through a number of the policies in the plan. Secondly, the objective is the contribution towards the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change, and I highlight in particular the word contribute. the plan is dealing with the land use and development management matters at the local level. But it is part of a wider network of local and national initiatives that are focused on the same end, and I'll come back to that. And thirdly, when we're assessing that contribution, that is through the prism of the NPPF, paragraphs 94, 95 and 97 in particular of the 2012 NPPF. And I highlight all of these points of context at the start because in the Council's submission there are a number of representations that essentially stray away from that central prism through which we're looking at the policies this afternoon. So we reiterate that as the starting point. The second issue is the Council's climate change strategy. You'll have seen that referred to in a number of representations. Mr Gibbons, in fact, is the author of the draft, and you have that in the examination library EXCYC 104. But that also needs to be put in its proper context. It sets the Council's ambitions for tackling climate change within its area. It is intended to be adopted in the near future following recent consultation. But it is going to be complemented by a subsequent yet-to-be-produced delivery plan. So that is its role. But it's important to note, as I'm sure you have if you've looked at it, that it is wide-ranging. It covers a large number of matters which are frankly unrelated to land use planning for the purposes of this examination. Insofar as it does touch on matters which are relevant, those matters go to the suite of policies that the Council has prepared. Obvious examples, flooding and waste that we looked at this morning, green infrastructure and transport that we looked at last week. Certainly on the Council's part, we don't intend to repeat the submissions we made in respect of those matters, and we don't anticipate the discussion moving in that direction either. But it's really clear to understand that the local plan is just one part of the Council's wider climate change strategy. It is not and cannot be the sole delivery mechanism for dealing with climate change in the Council's area. And again, the Council submits that that's important for considering a number of the representations which seem to lose sight of how this plan as a land use plan fits in with the wider network of obligations. And then the third issue is the building regulations. This is principally in respect of policy CC2, but it is raised by a number of participants in respect of other questions as well. I just want to be really clear on what the framework is for considering the building regulations. The Council is empowered to include policies within the plan which require development to comply with energy efficiency standards that exceed those in the building regulations at present. See Section 1 of the Planning and Energy Act 2008, and we refer to that in our matter statement. The Deregulation Act, which has been referred to by a number of participants, did include provision which was intended to repeal that power, and that's Section 43 of the Deregulation Act. But importantly, that part of the Deregulation Act has not yet come into force. So the position is, as of today, and for the purposes of examining this plan, that the Council has that power to include more strenuous standards. And that's a position that, insofar as there's any doubt, was confirmed by the Secretary of State last year in his consultation response on the Future Home Standard. And again, we've included that in our matter statement. So that is the power the Council is exercising. We say it's entirely lawful, it's in accordance with national policy and guidance. We'll come on to the specifics of the policy, but in terms of why is it there in the framework, that is the context in which we need to consider this issue. So any in-principle objection to it, we would resist in light of that, but we'll come on to that in due course. But to set the scene on that issue, I just want to be clear where we are. So they are the three sort of overarching issues I wanted to touch on at the start. Perhaps if we take each policy in turn, I'll ask Ms Bartle to give you, with Mr Gibbons' assistance, a brief introduction, and then we can discuss them.
Thank you. So if we start with the policy CC1, a number of amendments or modifications have been proposed here. The first paragraph is proposed to be removed, deleted from the policy. That relates to something, the carbon emissions reduction that we are dealing with entirely in CC2. So the focus of CC1 is intended to be standalone energy generation proposals. And at paragraph 2, the modifications there are simply for clarity, recognising that last sentence that it was not the policy's position to require or demonstrate local community support, recognising that there's potential difficulties with interpretation of that point. The modifications in the third paragraph provide clarity on the impacts that are listed in the criteria that follow, and making clear that those impacts need to be considered on a direct, indirect, individual or cumulative basis, which is consistent with the NPPF. Some other modifications for clarity also proposed. The reference at the end of the list of criteria, we've got a requirement for other technologies to be considered in the context of national policy or guidance, and that's really reflecting the NPPF position on specific technologies relating to matters such as wind turbines, where there are specific requirements in place, so felt that we needed to give some acknowledgement to that. The deleted text underneath that paragraph is deemed redundant and dealt with in CC2, which I'll come on to shortly, and then a minor modification for clarity and effectiveness relating to the energy storage developments, and acknowledging that they too should be subject to those criteria that are listed in the policy. And then related to those changes, some modifications to the explanatory text, which have in effect taken out the detail of the rationale and the basis for setting standards, which, as I say, is now dealt with in a separate policy in CC2.
So do you want Ms Bartle to run through all of the policies, or do you want to structure this policy by policy? I'm in your hands.
Okay, then policy CC2, we have quite a number of modifications here, which, as I suggested, we're focusing on the design and, in part, the energy efficiency and carbon reduction opportunities that development may present. What we've done just more broadly here is attempt to provide a bit more structure to the policy, recognising that it was difficult to understand which bits related to which parts of development. So simply structured around residential developments, commercial or non-residential, conversions and changes of use, and then requirements specifically for strategic sites to aid readability as much as anything else. So the introductory paragraphs have got some modifications which are effectively, again, for clarity, making clear what the expectations are on applicants, and with a clearer expression of the expectation for proposals to be supported by a sustainability and energy statement, and reflecting the energy hierarchy, which was referred to in later parts of the policy, but we've positioned it up front to make that a bit clearer. Turning then to requirements for residential developments, here we set out the approach to carbon emission reductions, and I'll ask Mr Gibbons shortly to comment specifically on the approach taken here and how that relates to building regulations. There are in effect two parts to it. The first is an expectation for all developments to achieve a minimum standard, and we're seeking to go above that standard where it's feasible and viable to do so. So perhaps, Sean, Mr Gibbons, if you can provide some explanation on the approach to the carbon reductions on the residential schemes, please.
Yeah, sure. So we have increased the carbon emissions reduction requirement for residential developments in line with the new building regs that were brought out in June 2022. But there's an additional element to that where we're requiring at least a 19% emissions reduction coming from energy efficiency measures. And the explanation and rationale for that is to reduce overall energy demand and not potentially put new residents, new tenants into fuel poverty as a result of higher energy bills. And we're also anticipating the future implementation of Future Homes Standard, which will be brought in, government are under consultation on that right now, which would require a 75% reduction in carbon emissions over and above requirements of the building regs, Part L 2013, and asking where it's viable to do so, that developments meet that requirement.
And then we turn to non-residential development, where we've set out here the 28% reduction, which is aligned to building regulations, but additionally require the BREEAM excellent or equivalent to be achieved. But notably, we've set a threshold for achieving that, recognising that as originally submitted, it would be triggered at 100 square metres, but seeing and reflecting on that and recognising that the challenges of doing that on a small scheme are difficult, and that 1,000 square metres is consistent with other local authority approaches. So that was deemed appropriate in that context. The Part C, we've taken out, if we're following it through, we've taken out the references to the strategic site requirements and simply relocated those to the bottom of the policy as a separate requirement, but in effect the requirement is as was submitted, and that's for the strategic sites to undertake a BREEAM communities assessment. So there's no change effectively to that requirement. With regards to conversions of existing buildings and changes of use, some additional wording for clarity here, and the recognition that we needed to specify in regards to the non-residential conversions, which BREEAM element we were referring to. We've also, just underneath that, rephrased the approach, rephrased the section dealing with heritage or buildings of heritage value, retaining the need to achieve a BREEAM standard, but recognising that there's often a balanced approach that needs to be taken, and words to that effect. And then just finally, in regards, the final change is a deletion of what was titled consequential improvement to existing dwellings, which is in effect householder applications. On reflection, felt it was not a proportionate requirement to specify anything specific in that respect. And then the modifications to the explanatory text really just tie in with those changes that I've just been through, and provide further information in terms of the expectation of the sustainability and energy statement that should support applications, and some associated deleted text with the sections of the policy I've just talked through taken out.
Just before you go on to policy CC3, which I think is what you're about to do.
Yes.
Yeah, so Mr. Henderson was telling us in opening there that it's lawful, he says, to exceed the building regs. Just so that everyone is clear, can you tell us exactly where in policy CC2 there would be an exceedance of the requirements of the building regulations?
Yes, sir. It's in regards to the residential development and the 31% that's referred to as the on-site carbon reduction is the current building regs requirement, but what exceeds that is the 19% of that which should come from energy efficiency measures, which is the fabric first approach that Mr. Gibbons referred to. And then additionally, underneath that part of the policy, we refer to the 70% up to 75% reduction in carbon emissions, and it is that also which is the higher than building regs requirement. But we do include the caveat that only in those cases where it's feasible and viable to do so. But that is also the requirement that's anticipated in the Future Homes Standard.
Thank you.
So policy CC3 we've retitled as decentralised energy networks, simply on the basis that we wanted to take away some of the emphasis on what's sometimes perceived as a fossil fuel based approach, and that's not what the council's seeking to promote. So it seemed appropriate to give it a more appropriate title. The modifications that are proposed here in the first paragraph deal with exactly that matter, recognising that the council will support combined cooling, heating and power networks where it's not a fossil fuel based network. The introduction underneath that of a new paragraph is intended to provide a sequential approach for applicants to consider the potential connection to decentralised energy networks as part of the requirements, and this would relate to major developments only. Explanatory text is provided, additional new explanatory text is provided to give that greater clarity and detail. And that section in effect replaces what was originally included as the heating and cooling hierarchy. We've then also removed the final part of what we've now given as references as paragraph C to that final sentence is removed because it's in effect replaced by the new paragraph at B, and the final paragraph D is removed on the basis that the requirement for the energy statements is what's included in policy CC2 now and doesn't need to be included here. That said, there is a reference, I think, to demonstrating through those energy statements in the explanatory text how that sequential approach to connecting to a energy network should be taken forward and prepared as part of that statement. We've taken out in the explanatory text the figure 11.1 and associated references to where that figure came from, which was in the an opportunity mapping report. Not because we find that evidence cannot be relied upon, but just in recognition that that's a moment in time and things have moved on since then. And again, for clarity, that figure isn't seeking to direct or infer that developments in these locations should be doing something that shouldn't be the case elsewhere. What that evidence provides is evidence of potential opportunity for heat networks to exist at the time that that work was undertaken, but it's not intended to be used to as a sequential approach to that matter. And yes, the rest of the deleted text relates to deletions associated with what we've taken out of the policy.
So I think we'll leave it there by way of an open to the discussion, if that's all right.
That's a very helpful introduction to the changes. I wanted that set out to give a context for what we'll discuss now. I'd like to deal with, when it comes to submissions that people might want to make, I'd like to deal with the policies in turn. So if we can deal with CC1 as proposed to be amended first. Does anyone have anything they want to say about that particular policy as changed? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. I did expect to be coming to discuss what I'd previously submitted to yourselves about battery engineering storage system concerns, especially between Osborwick and Merton. And I was expecting to be concentrating more on the landscape impact and the progressive degradation of the green belt that these systems could potentially cause. But I'm afraid I'm just going to jump straight to paragraph 11.7. I'm absolutely amazed at this change and deletion. It was bad enough that one of these systems has been approved without due consideration of the safety implications, but we now see that the supplementary planning document that we may or may not have seen in due course has now been deleted. So how on earth can the Council's support of these energy storage systems be considered sound without a proper consideration of the safety aspects? And I would draw the Inspector's attention in particular to the situation in Carnegie Road, Liverpool, not so long back, and the report that was produced into that very dangerous situation that came out on the 5th of June 2021, and it was safety of grid-scale lithium-ion battery engineering storage systems. There's three main contributors. I'll just name one if you wish to look it up, and that was Dr. Edmund Fordham. Now, that was a 20 megawatt system, quite close to residential properties. Took 11 hours to bring under control and 59 hours to extinguish. You've not only got the problems of the toxic gas when these things go up, but the inordinate amount of water that is needed to cool these systems if they run out of control, and hydrofluoric acid that it creates. Now, in particular, the concerns with the system between Osborwick and Merton and the larger scheme that has applied to the council, well, it put a scoping opinion in, is the number of becks and watercourses. Also allied to that is the fact that we're now going to enjoy a reduction in fire cover in York. And I really think this supplementary planning document, looking into safety requirements of these sites, is an absolute must before any further BESS systems are proposed and approved in York. I could go on at further length, but I think you've got the gist of what I'm saying there, and I really think that paragraph, it just can't be allowed to go forward as it is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. Mr. Henderson?
Sir, the first point to make is if one looks at policy CC1 at the very end of that policy, just before cross-references, you'll see that specific mention is made to fire suppression procedures. So not omitted, considered there. So we don't accept there's any omission in that respect. Nor do we accept that an SPD is necessary in order to address that matter. what is in the policy at present is sufficient. Insofar as matters of fire safety aren't dealt with through another regime, I have in mind permitting and in some installations, then that will of course be a material consideration in the development management procedure in the usual way. None of that is particularly unorthodox or controversial or indeed unusual. So we, in terms of what this policy needs to do in order to be sound in the context of the framework that I outlined at the start, and I did it deliberately for exactly this sort of submission, there is no hook that requires the council to go any further in these policies to address the concern that's been raised.
Councillor Waters, did you want to add anything?
You would have thought a responsible local authority would want to go that extra mile, especially given the concerns over these storage units. Why then was that sentence originally put in the draft local plan? That a supplementary planning document will be produced in due course, including on safety requirements for storage sites. Now, I sat on the planning committee that determined this particular application. My memory might have failed, but I don't recall much in the way of discussion or concerns raised in the planning officer's report regarding fire safety. Of course, that determination predated the significant fire and safety concerns in Liverpool, and you would think that the council would want to take that on board now and actually go forward with that supplementary planning document to make this policy sound.
Am I reading the inclusion of a reference to a suitable distance from major residential areas and have suitable fire suppression procedures as a way of putting the onus on the applicant to demonstrate that those things have been dealt with properly, rather than the council producing a document telling people what the council thinks might be necessary? Is it just it's putting responsibility onto the applicant to demonstrate those things?
That's correct, sir, yes. I think it's fair to say that the safety concerns that Councillor Waters raises, although I totally understand what they are nevertheless contested. If you had the developers of these sites here, you would hear a different side of the story. That's inevitable. So this approach says to those developers, well, tell us about the specific technology you're proposing, because of course the requirements for fire suppression, for example, will differ depending on what specific technology it is, and explain to the council how you are addressing the issue. And we say that is the appropriate way, rather than an SPD that would have to grapple with this in a way that wouldn't be proportionate or necessary. Each and every iteration of the technology, how is it going to deal with each of those? For example, the better way, we say, is the approach adopted here. The onus on the applicant to address the issue to the satisfaction of the local planning authorities, not omitted. There's no need for an SPD to plug a gap. It is there, it's considered, and it's dealt with in a way that acknowledges the concern but deals with it proportionately, and we say nothing further is required for the purposes of soundness.
So essentially, if a proposal, one of these battery storage systems is proposed that the council thinks is too close to a residential area and doesn't demonstrate to the council's satisfaction that it has proper fire suppression measures within it, then the council says it's contrary to the policy, and the answer is no.
So yes, that's correct, because each and every development, depending on its scale, depending on the technology used, will have to be a different distance away from residential development. It's essentially a process of assessing risk and assessing measures in place. Frankly, quite a lot of that might be dealt with by other regimes, but even if it isn't, even if we assume worst case scenario, it does fall into the council's scope of considerations, then yes, it will function in the way that you've just summarised there.
Am I right in thinking too that a lot of these well, anything of this sort that came forward is likely to be in the Greenbelt too?
Not necessarily, sir. I wouldn't. I mean, there's a healthy proportion of York that is greenbelt land, but I wouldn't like to go beyond the generalisation in that we wouldn't, for example, rule out brownfield land sites may be suitable for these sorts of developments.
Councillor Waters?
Just for a bit more clarity on that, I think if any more of these applications come forward, they've got to be located near major national grid infrastructure, and there is only one major site for this, so there is only one place where they're likely to come forward, and that will be in the Greenbelt. And just for further clarity, rather than me just raising this, it was actually a lecturer from the university who first raised these safety concerns with me and asked me to bring this up. These are genuine concerns, and I don't believe they've been addressed properly in this local plan. And there are concerns that have arisen since the 2018 approval of this particular site that I refer to. And I would suggest, sir, if you get the time, to look at one of those application links that I sent you, which is the application for a scoping opinion, and you'll see then how the council have dealt with the safety aspects of it. There's not a lot there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. Was there anything to add, Mr Henderson?
No, I've addressed those points already in the previous submissions.
Okay, well, thank you. Professor May.
Yes, my apologies. I'm sorry if I'm disrupting the chain of discussion, but I just wanted to check when you plan to discuss your question 14.1, which was the overarching one. Might it be sensible to come back to that after looking at the individual policies?
Well, yeah, I see your point. Yeah, it might be better to do it at the end. Let's go through them individually. Yes, I've framed that question in quite a closed way, haven't I? So sorry, apologies for that. But yes, we'll come back to it and make sure we don't forget it. Is there anything else on CC1 specifically? Carry on. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sirs. Just in reference to applications, proposals for renewable low carbon energy development on page 1 here will be permitted subject to the following considerations are demonstrated to be acceptable. Given the need that we have for renewables and given how much land solar power would actually take up that we need, I think in our submission we say government estimates is 0.4 to 0.6% of land use we would need to generate the solar power that we need. Do you not think that this list of reasons that people can object to is just going to create a charter for people to try and stop developments that we need? And shouldn't it be a bit more robust? For example, do we need to have agriculture and other land-based industries in there at 0.7? Could that be taken out? And should there be more emphasis on the objectors having to show the reasons why they would be unacceptable given the need for these new sources of energy?
Yep, I take your point. I think what I would say before I come to Mr Henderson is that the plan has to comply with, well, put it in a gentler way than that, the plan has to take account of government policy on all of these matters. And I think the point you raise about impact on agriculture and other land-based industries comes from the written ministerial statement that dealt with solar power. That's of some vintage, but yeah, it has to accord with the government's approach. But Mr Henderson, did you want to add anything?
Well, so I'm grateful for that summary, which we agree with. I think all I would say in general terms, this is an example of a policy having to deal with competing views and competing perspectives. We've heard some of those already today, just in the submissions that we've had here. We say this is a sound approach to dealing with those competing perspectives. We acknowledge, on the one hand, the benefits of low carbon energy generation and storage, but on the other hand, we acknowledge that for them to come forward, there are a number of matters that need to be considered and addressed, and that is what this list of criteria do. There is planning judgment in terms of the acceptability of each of those, and we say that's an appropriate way of balancing the competing interests. There is, of course, inevitably in a large number of those applications, a range of other material considerations that go to the question of need. One need only think about national policy statements, for example, which are often relied upon and can be see the start of the NPPF in this context, which set out government's expression of need and which can support, in appropriate circumstances, such applications, particularly insofar as they are going to be revised in the near future. As to the agricultural land issue specifically, you have already heard, I'm thinking of some of the parish councillors who were particularly concerned by BMV and agricultural land last week. This is another example of an issue where the council has to draw a balance, and we've included it so that that balance can be drawn and this matter is considered. And then finally, on the question of what objectors require in evidence, the council undertakes consultation in line with the 2015 order. What evidence objectors wish to put in is a matter for them. Clearly, if there's an objection that is properly evidenced, that is likely to be one which the council will deal with accordingly. If it's an unevidenced objection, well, that might receive a different response, but we can't make any provision now for what will be required of objectors. That's all taken care of by the 2015 order.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Henderson. Reading through the criteria that you've got here, they are quite. I can't think of anything they don't cover, but those kind of matters, you know, experience tells me that they're typically the matters that one would come across if you were dealing with onshore wind or solar. So I don't think. What I'm trying to say in quite a clumsy way is I'm not sure you could take any of those out necessarily.
We agree, sir. Yeah, I would just highlight on the specific wording that the councillor raised a concern of. You need to, of course, recall this is a permissive policy. Will be permitted where. So there is. So I think his concern was this was essentially a bit too negative. Well, I'd say kind of the contrary. This is positively permissive of these developments, subject to the inevitable considerations.
Did you want to add anything, having heard that? But thank you. Yes. Anything else on CC1, Mr. Merritt?
Yeah, just sort of more of a flag in terms of the end of the first para referring to the climate change strategy and the textual support 11.8, the carbon reduction targets. I think they are an important issue. But I assume it would be best to take those in terms of when we do question 14.1.
I think that's probably best,
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's linked, isn't it? Anything else specific to CC1? Shall we move on to CC2? Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Really coming back to a number of points raised initially by Mr. Henderson and sort of with the proposed changes to CC2. First, I suppose it's helpful that it has been moved from CC1 and that deleted and moved to CC2 and would support that in terms of removing it from CC1. However, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding here by the council in terms of the building regulations and the going above and beyond those building regulations. I think recognise the Planning Act is there in 2008 and councils can go beyond that. But I think there's also the written ministerial statement as set out, mentioned in paragraph 6012 of PPG that clearly sets out that it shouldn't go beyond the 20% equivalent in terms of Code for Sustainable Homes 4. So it does refer back to that position in moving forward. And I think that's the clear starting point. Obviously, the building regulations that the propose, the council is saying 31%. Indeed, it was 31%. It's a mistake we've made in our hearing statements. Actually, if you look at the Option 2, which has been taken forward by the government, is actually a 27% improvement on building regulations within the response to the consultation, and that is in paragraph 3.10 of the response to the consultation, and that's what's moved forward. So actually there is a difference between what the council are proposing in their amendment in CC2 and what the building regulations are taking forward. So that is an inconsistency and one that should be addressed. But really, sir, there is no reason to go beyond that. The government is clear that they're looking at building regulations in terms of the improvement to energy efficiency and not through planning policy. The council should delete this element of the policy. It is seeking to merely repeat what is in building regulations, so therefore isn't necessary and isn't therefore consistent with paragraph 16 of the MPPF, which clearly says that we shouldn't be seeking to duplicate a national policy, and it's unnecessary to duplicate it. In terms of the 75%, I think there's, again, I would say that it's going beyond what the requirements of national policy are allowing for in terms of energy efficiency. It's also very unclear in terms of what the 75% is, in terms of what the council is seeking to achieve in this, and whether it's an encourage or whether it's a requirement. I think we'll find in the supporting text of the which is being proposed in paragraph 11.13b, it says policy CC2 therefore encourages developers to design home to meet the future anticipated legislative changes. So is it an encourage or a require? I suggest if it's a require, then it clearly goes beyond the scope of what is available. And if it's an encourage, then I don't think it's necessary, sir, in terms of, these are points that will be addressed by government through building regulations, and therefore it should just be deleted from the policy. If it is an encourage, it also provides no clarity in terms of there is a very much confusing position. If it is an encourage, it doesn't read as an encourage within the policy. It reads as a require. So I think that's a key concern of ours, sir. And finally, and it's really with regard to the 19% improvement in terms of come from energy efficiency measures. I couldn't see within the council's evidence how much of the existing building regulations will actually deliver the energy efficiency and how the council proposed to manage, monitor and ensure that's delivered. There isn't really much clarity within the policy as to how that would be achieved, and really, again, it's that level of uncertainty and lack of clarity that really points towards just the council sticking with building regulations, removing the requirements altogether from this policy, and really just allowing building regulations to address this issue both now and in the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson.
Right, so I'll deal with the in-principle points, and then I'll ask Mr. Gibbons to come back on some of the specifics. Let's deal firstly with the PPG point. So the point in the PPG, some vintage now, is to say, well, don't go beyond level 4 of the Code for Sustainable Homes. The suggestion seems to be that somehow limits the council's power. I don't accept that in any way. For this reason, it is clear that level has already been achieved through the amendments to the building regulations. That doesn't seem to be in dispute. So if that is so, that's the starting point, but the council still retains the power to go further, and we have, as we put in our statement, consultation responses explaining that councils still can go further. Well, where do the councils go? On the submissions that were just made to you, they go absolutely nowhere. They just hold the same level because building regs have caught up. Well, that's, in my submission, absolutely not the case. The councils can go further as new proposals come forward. And here we've got the Future Home Standards, which is the appropriate next step for councils to look to when they have this power that they are able to exercise. So that's the PPG point. It's then said, well, there's no reason to go further. I don't accept that. Specifically, either generally or specifically in the context of York. I referred you to the draft strategy. I hope not to have to take you here, but I think I will on this occasion. So can I ask you to turn that up, please? So that's CYC 104. And within that, can I ask you to go to PDF page 13? And there's a helpful diagram. And this describes the current situation in York. And you'll see in that diagram that two of the major contributing factors in York's greenhouse gas emissions are domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings. Cumulatively, that's 60%. Sorry, yeah, PDF page 13. And you'll see the pie chart at the top, sir. Hopefully this is an easy way to look at it. But in terms of local evidence, you've got 60% of the assessed emissions there in 2018 coming from buildings. And the strategy goes on. I don't need to go to it, but essentially the strategy goes on and identifies one of its objectives to be to address such emissions. So that's local evidence explaining why in the local context, leaving aside any national considerations, which I say there are many, there is support for the approach that the council is taking. The other point of more generally that was made was NPPF paragraph 16. I suspect that is a reference to the new NPPF rather than the 2012 NPPF, because in the 2012 NPPF that's talking about neighbourhood plans. But I think the point is being made, well, don't duplicate national policy. We talked about that a little bit this morning in a different context. But in essence, I don't accept that there's any duplication of national policy. No part of the NPPF or PPG has been highlighted to you, which is being duplicated here. And the approach that's been taken to building regulations, we say it's a sensible and appropriate approach. As Ms Bartle has explained, they are the points of principle. Mr Gibbons, I think, might want to deal with some of the specifics that were put about the different percentages. I'll let him deal with that now.
Thank you. Yeah, specifically the reference to the 75% reduction in anticipation of future home standard. Within the paragraph, it describes developments should further aim to achieve up to 75% reduction. That's an encouragement based on the need, the local need, evidence-based need to accelerate higher emission standards ahead of anticipated national implementation. As described, York has an ambition to deliver net zero carbon for the city by 2030, and we need to accelerate the delivery of those higher efficiency standards where it's viable and appropriate to do so amongst new builds. Just below that paragraph, there is also reference to other reductions required through building regulations or other legislation superseding the above requirements, and that gives flexibility within this document for changes in building regulations which have been referenced.
Yeah, I agree with Mr Berend, if I've pronounced your name correctly, on the point about clarity. Because paragraph, 11.13b is pretty clear that it's an encouragement. I'm not quite sure that this part of the policy is written that way. It strikes me as being rather more, well, do this unless, which is what it says.
Well, so the policy is right, and we'll amend the support and test. It's not an encourage, it is a do unless not feasible or viable. And Mr Elvin addressed you on the viability bit when we looked at strategic sites.
Ah, right, because I thought I just heard Mr Gibbons say that it was an encouragement.
So it's an encouragement in that it is an initiative which encourages. It's not a nice to have. We are encouraging it by requiring it, if that makes sense.
Are you suggesting that you would respond to that question by leaving the policy alone but doing something in the...
Correct. 13b we can tighten up, that's fine.
Mr Berend, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yes, sir. Apologies for the reference to the 2021 MPPF. I've come to this examination a bit late. I'd forgot it had been going on for so long due to the vagaries of York in terms of the speed at which they like to take these things. But yes, it feels like well in Hatfield. But in terms of the, I think the 2012 MPPF is clear that there shouldn't be any duplication in terms of between policy, and I think that it is clear. I think in terms of the position, I think PPG and the written ministerial statement was clear that there should not, the statement sets out that the government's expectation that such policies should not be used to set conditions on planning permissions with requirements above the equivalent of the energy requirement. So it is very clear that they shouldn't be going above that. The government has been clear that it wants to use building regulations to introduce the improvements to the fabric and not to the not through local plans. I think it is going well beyond what the requirements of policy are, and it shouldn't be that. I think in terms of the 75%, I think that's going significantly beyond what is currently required. I don't think it's consistent with national policy and the requirements moving forward, and I would suggest that it needs to be removed. I think the significant lack of clarity of whether it's an encourage, whether it's an aim, whether it should be achieved shows the council's lack of understanding in terms of what it is seeking to achieve and putting in these additional requirements. And they should be removed, sir. And also, I didn't follow it in terms of the 19%, in terms of actually how that that will be assessed in terms of the 19% improvement in energy efficiency. I may just not have heard or not understood, but any clarity over that position from Mr. Gibbons. And apologies if I might have just been not listening at that point, but that would be very helpful.
So let me deal with the point of principle first. The suggestion seems to be that the council has this power and the government has an amendment which is pending, which it could at any point in time very easily bring into force to remove this power, but it hasn't done so. Really important to note, it hasn't done so. And the suggestion appears to be, well, despite the fact that there is this power and it's an extant power, well, nevertheless, it's one that we are to disregard because of the PPG. That, in my submission, particularly having regard to the age of that part of the PPG, is simply untenable. If that was what was intended, then what would have been done is that Section 43 of the 2015 Deregulation Act would have been used to remove this power altogether. It wasn't, because it leaves the flexibility for the council and local planning authorities to use that power in appropriate circumstances. That is exactly what the council has done in my submission here, and I've taken you to the local evidence which deals with that. So there was no inconsistency, there was no difficulty in any respect in that regard. Let's deal with the numbers. Mr. Gibbons, 75%, do you want to just explain the context and the provenance of that, please?
Yes, the 75% is direct reference to anticipated standards in line with the Future Homes standard, which the government has set out and will come into effect in the future, I think 2025, given the local...
Will it?
Well, so we don't know, but there's a sort of a so what question. We have that as...
Well, my question is about the justification for the 75%, and I think that you are resting your justification for it on the Future Home Standard, which may or may not be brought forward by the government.
Correct, sir, but we don't need it to be brought into force for the purposes of justifying this policy, because it's been identified as the appropriate next step in terms of where the building regulations goes. That's been identified as part of the Future Home Standard as the appropriate next step. What we're actually concerned with is not the level, but the timing. And we say, well, actually, the specific local evidence that, as Mr. Gibbons said, requires us to accelerate that. And that is what this policy does. It doesn't change the substance, it changes the timing. So in my submission, that's really important. It's not about going to a different location, it's about going to the same location just a bit quicker.
I would add that the Future Home Standard is a mechanism by which the government can achieve its own legally binding carbon emissions reduction target by 2050. Our ambition is significantly faster than that, hence the need to accelerate implementation.
Mr. Gibbons, the 19%, do you want to just explain that figure as well?
The way developments can demonstrate compliance with 19% fabric first energy efficiency improvements is through the energy hierarchy, which is provided in paragraph 11.12b. So being lean, using less energy, they demonstrate that through a fabric first approach and the subsequent reduction in energy demand of that development.
Can I just ask one other thing, Mr. Henderson? You talked about the PPG. Can you address the written ministerial statement?
The WMS is incorporated into that paragraph, the PPG. Let me pull it up, but I'm fairly sure that's the point made. Miss Bartle, I think, has it to hand. Sorry, try that again. So the part of the PPG that I think is being referred to is one that's dated from 2015. That's the first point to note. And that, I think, is a simple transposition of what was said in the WMS. I don't think there's been suggested there was any difference between the two. WS was made and the PPG updated accordingly in light of the WMS. I mean, we've seen it elsewhere. As I understand it, I mean, that's the point that's being made against us, as I understand it. And the straightforward response is the one that I've given you. This power still exists. The building regulations have moved on and assumed that level 4 of the code, but the power has remained. Why is that? Because local authorities remain able, as the Secretary of State reiterated only last year, to go beyond what is the current level of building regulations, precisely as we're proposing to do here. It would be very odd in my submission if the way to deal with this was through the PPG and the WMS rather than Section 43 of the Deregulation Act. It was sat there ready to go on the statute, but not yet in force. It was sat there ready to go at the point in time where the Secretary of State thought, well, that's enough. I don't want local planning authorities to go any further. In those circumstances, the mechanism to remove that power was there. It would be very odd to try and to circumvent that through the PPG and a WMS.
That's helpful, thank you. Mr. Barrett, was there anything you wanted to?
It was just really to suggest that from Mr. Henderson is saying to ignore what the WMS and as planning policy and as government policy to ignore their position set out in the WMS. And I think that which the statement comes after the 2008 Act. And I think it is clear that you shouldn't be ignoring what national policy says and what the government have reiterated in PPG is their position. And I think that what Mr. Henderson is saying is to ignore that completely. Within his submissions, and I would say that that's an incorrect position, and actually you should be looking at what government is saying with regard to policy and what council should be doing with going beyond level Part L of the 2013 building regulations. I think to do so is not consistent with national policy as set out in that written ministerial statement, and we must remember written ministerial statement should be read as government policy. And so in my submission, I think he's wrong in terms of his position. Thank you, sir.
I think I understand where you're both coming from on that. Ms. Dukes, did you want to say something?
Thank you, sir. Just to make the same points, well, I'm not going to repeat the same points, but it's just to make the point that, as written, it does read as a requirement rather than an aim or an objective to encourage the 75% reduction, because of the end of the sentence in the policy, which states, unless it is demonstrated that such reduction would not be feasible or viable. Obviously, that is a requirement. And then just to skip to paragraph 1113B, yeah, this idea of trying to achieve targets that have not yet been brought in, I thought that for a plan to be found sound, it needs to be in accordance with current policy and guidance. And this idea of trying to achieve beyond that seems to go beyond what is expected of soundness, not to mention the Deregulation Act actually refers to how local authorities shouldn't ask for higher standards than sought by building regs in setting planning policies. Just to skip then, if I can, 1113C, it says any proposed reduction of at least 28% in carbon emissions in non-residential. It doesn't refer to what the 28 is in respect to. What's the baseline, please? If we could have one. And then I'm going to go back to, can I talk about BREEAM yet? Or do you want to stick on residential?
I'm happy to carry on, but Mr. Barclay, was there something you wanted to ask now?
Well, so from my perspective, I'd rather deal with those points and anything that Mr. Barclay has before moving.
Mine's very closely related. Yeah, it's about this, the 75% and the justification for it, which I know you told me something about it a moment ago, Mr. Henderson. My apologies. I'm not sure that I entirely followed what you were saying, and I suppose what I'm trying to understand is whether the 75%, why 75%? And I'm not sure if, as 1113B perhaps suggests, that is because of the future homes standard, which we don't have yet, or whether the council is pointing to its local evidence in respect of the 75%, maybe as well, in addition to the future home standard point.
So let me address that head on first, and I'll deal with the other points. I suspect it's because I explained it rather than Mr. Gibbons. There is local evidence that supports the general need to move faster in our journey to that location. But Mr. Gibbons will explain, hopefully a bit more clearly than I did, where that 75% comes from.
Well, that is reference to the requirements under the Future Homes Standard as stated by the government requirements for the future. But as mentioned, we have a need to move quicker given our ambition is much faster than the nationally legally binding target of net zero by 2050.
So hopefully that's clear on where it's from, sir. In terms of the other points that were made, we are not in any sense overlooking the WMS or the PPG. What we're recognising is, well, what's happened since that time? So the PPG and the WMS we're dealing with from 2015, don't have the exact date, we're dealing with a 2015 statement. Well, what's happened since then? Well, actually that level 4 of the code that was referred to at that point in time has already been achieved through the amendments to the building regulations. So my submissions actually take that into account, because it looks at it today, it looks at it on the basis of what is the situation today. Well, we've already got that, and but we've still got the power, and we've got positive recent encouragement from the government that we can use that power in appropriate circumstances. And in that context, in my submission, it's actually more consistent to take the approach that the council has, which is we've got the power, so let's use it appropriately now, rather than what I say is an inconsistent approach, which is to try to tie matters back to 2015 without taking into account what's happened since then. So that is my response on the overlooking point. Turning to Ms. Dukes, is it required? Yes, it is. I hope I've been clear on that now. We'll tidy up 13B. Is it a target beyond? Well, I think that goes back to the point that Mr Gibbons explained about where that 75% is coming from. Yes, it's beyond building regulations as they are today, but we've taken that from the Future Homes Standard. There was a reference back to Section 43, I think it was, of the Deregulation Act. The short point is that's not yet in force. If it was, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that doesn't, I'm afraid, assist the arguments that are put against this policy in any respect. And then that only leaves paragraph 11.13c and the 28%. And I'll just get Mr Gibbons to clear up the confusion on that point.
That's from a baseline taken from Building Regs Part L 2013.
And I think that's referred to in the actual
Referred
policy.
to in the policy itself, yes.
Ms Dukes, you wanted to talk about BREEAM.
Just one other point that I've just thought while Mr Henderson was talking. I'm just wondering, where's this evidence? Why does York need to move faster than the rest of the country in setting targets? So I'm not quite clear why there's local evidence to suggest that all the targets need to be set so much higher than what the government's suggesting in terms of building regs, Decentralisation Act, all these targets. We seem to be setting higher targets in York beyond and trying to achieve beyond what the government's actually said that needs to be achieved, and that's slightly confusing to me.
Am I understanding, and again, forgive me, but the government's net zero target is 2050, York's is 2030. Is it as simple as that, or is there more to it than that?
Well, so that I think you might call the context for it. But the evidence, I go back to that pie chart that I showed you. We've looked at, well, when we make our contribution towards mitigating and an adaptation for the purpose of Section 19, what are the big ticket items that York needs to address? And when we look at that pie chart, which tells us where the emissions are, 60% are coming from domestic and non-domestic buildings. So that is, in the context of York, a priority. It may well be in a different area of the country that 60% is a much lower figure, and transport, say, might be a much higher figure, in which case that local authority is going to have to take a different approach. But we've got that local evidence, which is just saying that this is a significant, in fact, a majority of the net emissions assessed at that date, and it needs to be addressed on that basis. A specific local problem, specific local response. BREEAM, I think, is the next issue, unless you want me to go into those other points any further. Ms Bartle, I think, is on top of the BREEAM point. Oh, sorry, the viability. Let me just pick that up on the viability. You will recall Mr Porter's evidence back in the second phase when we were looking at strategic sites and in terms of what's been appraised. The BREEAM appraisal was undertaken on the basis of 2014 BREEAM, but what Mr Porter's done is a sense check to say, well, look, 2014 is now 2018. Does it make any difference? And the answer is it makes no material difference to the viability calculations which he has already put into evidence in this examination. So that has been considered. It hasn't been omitted. I don't think there's... Do you want to say anything? Yeah, so that I think is all I need to say on the viability point there. And Ms Bartle will just give you the background to the BREEAM in a little bit more detail. In fact, I'll leave it there. I suspect that addresses the point, and if there's anything further, we'll come back on it in due course.
Mr Berrant?
Just a really final point on the evidence. In terms of the council's position, in terms of 60% of the energy efficient CO2 emissions coming from domestic properties, obviously that's from most of that is from existing dwellings that won't have been built to the 2013 building regulations, and therefore the majority of the emissions will still continue to come from those unless those energy efficiency improvements are made to existing properties. So actually what you'll find is that properties built to the new standards will be providing significantly less carbon emissions moving forward from the latest building regulations that are put forward. And then obviously from 2025, should those future home standards be delivered, there's even less. So I think in terms of the local evidence with regard to existing properties, that's one that we'll find similar across the country, and it is a national issue, and one that I think is recognised in terms of trying to improve the energy efficiency of existing properties. But I don't think it's a specific York one for saying York should go beyond that. I think York, like other areas in terms of energy efficiency, should look at the building regulations and ensure that there is a consistent approach to delivering those building regulations and moving forward in that transition to those energy efficiency homes as set out in the future home standards in the recent consultation. So thank you. I'll rest there.
Thank you. Ms. Dukes, did you have anything you wanted to add about BREEAM specifically or anything else?
Yes, so I'd actually like to talk about the energy hierarchy, the water efficiency, and also then BREEAM. So I don't know if there's a particular order you'd like me to take them in. Should we do one at a time? All right. If we can just turn to the energy hierarchy under paragraph 1112b. To be honest, I don't recognise that as the energy hierarchy. To be lean, to be clean, to be green, to be seen. It sounds like something more appropriate to something on television or a magazine than a planning policy. The energy hierarchy I recognise is one that says energy reduction, then energy efficiency, renewable energy, low carbon energy, and then conventional energy. It's just, I just really don't understand where that's come from all of a sudden, or the terms that are being used. What's particularly bothering me is the last line, which is be seen, providing monitoring data to measure effectiveness. All of a sudden, it feels like there's an additional policy requirement amongst the explanation that's not actually explicit in the policy. And I'm just wondering how on earth if this is going to be administered, because usually, planning permission is granted, there might be a condition to do with implementation of drawings or the energy strategy, but how is this monitoring data and measuring its effectiveness actually going to be dealt with as an ongoing requirement? It seems to be overly burdensome to require